Okay, so we're over to lesson 2 on the AstroFX Fundamentals series, and in this one we'll be discussing GDP and inflation. GDP, so it's gross domestic product. So we've got a little chart there of all the countries in the world that have the highest GDP, and this is actually a forecast for 2019, but you can see the United States are way in the lead, with China second there and Japan third. So this is the Investopedia explanation, and it says gross domestic product is the total monetary or market value of all finished goods and services produced within the country's borders in a specific time period. As a broad measure of overall domestic production, it functions a comprehensive scorecard of the country's economic health. So I'm going to simplify this. It's basically how much money a particular economy makes. It's important because we need to know as well with each economies which ones are performing well and which ones aren't, and the differences between them. Real results versus consensus estimates are very important because each bank and each analyst will give us an idea of where they think GDP is for that particular country. If GDP does better, then the currency will go higher. If GDP does worse, it will go lower. And if it just stays roughly where all the consensus estimates are, the likelihood is that it won't move that much. So that's the important part here, is that how people measure it and how they make their guesses on GDP and whether they're right or not. You know, normally we like surprises basically because that inspires volatility in the market. How this impacts price. Most traders and economists have an idea of what GDP is for each nation. The important thing is if it's better or worse than those expectations, and what are the difference between emerging markets and developed markets. So we'll basically spend a bit of time on this now. So China, for example, is an emerging market. It's not saturated. Things are still growing there. Their GDP is between 5 and 6% every single year. But in a market like the US or the UK, we're at basically a full economic standpoint. It's hard for us to grow year on year because the markets are saturated here. There's not much more that we can grow that's already been grown, if you know what I mean. So in China, it's a new market. There's lots of new things that need to be built, new infrastructure, new shops, new technologies. So they've got a much higher GDP than ours. It means, yes, obviously they're performing better, but in relative terms, in terms of where they are in GDP, the UK and the US are way far ahead because we've developed those things already. Who are importers and who are exporters? Now this has a big impact on GDP because if you're an importing nation like the US and the UK, you import most of your goods from abroad to resell them basically within your economy. So we don't really produce many things in the UK. A lot of our cars are imported. A lot of our finished products are imported. So we basically rely on our currency to be strong to kind of bring those things in for cheaper so we can sell them internally. But if you're a nation like Canada or Australia, you export a lot of your goods. You export oil, you export base metals. So you're going to need basically for those countries who buy those things off you to perform well, for you to perform well. So you're really a secondary market. Whereas if you're the UK and US, you produce your own, you buy your stuff in and you sell your stuff with inside. So you're a primary market. Now these things give us clues to monetary policy. If your GDP is performing better than you ever expected, you might raise interest rates at this point. But if you're struggling and you're not selling things, you're basically your GDP is low, you might have to stimulate your economy somehow. And some bankers, they print more money and put it back into market to see if people spend it to boost the economy. So that's like investing in your own economy. Now, GDP ties very closely with inflation. I'll explain why. So this is the Investopedia explanation of inflation. Inflation is a quantitative measure of the rate at which the average price level of a basket of select goods and services in an economy increases over a period of time. It is the constant rise or a general level of prices where a unit of a currency buys less than it did in prior periods and often is expressed as a percentage. Inflation indicates a decrease in the purchasing power of a nation's currency. So, simplifying this again, it's basically how much do the goods cost. So we've got a little shopping basket there. So how much do things in that shopping basket cost? Whether the price of them goes up month on month, year on year, or down month on month, year on year. How does it affect you? So this is key. If you earn all your money in pounds, but the pound is getting weaker and you're importing all your goods from abroad, you're going to have to pay more for your goods. So over there we've got bananas, eggs, things like that in there, wine. A lot of these things are imported. So if the pound gets weaker, the shops, it's going to cost them more to bring it into their shops, and it's going to cost us more to buy it. So that's inflation and how it affects you. Why is it important in terms of FX? Because if inflation gets too high, so let's say we get to 3-4% or something like that, the central bank are going to need the currency to get stronger to manage the balance of inflation. So they might raise interest rates. They might cut down on the amount of money they're printing. So they've got a few monetary policy tools to manage inflation, and they'll choose one of those things to kind of bring it back in line, because nobody wants the cost of their goods to rise too quickly. And that's why we've got little weighing scales there. That's what inflation is. So you want wages to rise and inflation to rise at the same rate for you to keep going. Then you want the growth of the country, so the GDP, and inflation to rise at a decent rate. Preferably you want growth to rise more than inflation is rising. Which part of the market has room to maneuver? Now, what we mean by this is that if inflation is above 2% and your interest rates are down at 1%, potentially you've got a bit of space to rise your interest rates, but to keep up with inflation. People want rates and inflation to be hand in hand, because you don't want inflation to move higher, so the cost of goods to move higher, but your money to move backwards, so inflation to move backwards. So they call this real inflation or real interest rates sometimes, and that's the difference between the two. How to control inflation? It's tricky, this one. So the main thing is basically your currency. If you're an importing nation like the UK, if the goods get too expensive for the consumers, you're going to have to raise your interest rates to make your currency stronger, to then push inflation lower. It does take a little bit of time. There's a bit of a lagging effect, obviously, but this is the main way of doing that. What effect does it have on an FX pair? So FX traders, they know that central banks watch inflation carefully. That's part of their mandate. So if inflation gets too high, the currency will move up, because people will bet that interest rates will start to change based on inflation. If inflation gets too low, then they're going to look at ways to stimulate their economy, and they might have to cut interest rates as well to try and manage that. This is like I said, the key point of it is it gives us clue to the path of monetary policy. Do they need their currency to be weaker or stronger? Will they add QE? Will they raise interest rates or lower interest rates? So the main things to take away with this is each country has their own targets for inflation. So all the developed nations have a 2% target for inflation, because they want their inflation rate to grow 2%, and they want to be able to raise their interest rates or have some flexibility with their interest rates to basically work on that. If anything changes and you see inflation just absolutely dump in one country and get really, really low, then you know that the monetary policy committees are going to have to act to stabilize this. And normally it works like this: if inflation is higher, then interest rates are going to have to go up. If inflation is lower, then interest rates are going to have to go down to help get inflation back, basically. Now, there have been some problems with the inflation in the future and at the moment, purely because people buy a lot of things from Amazon. If you remember, we looked at a basket of goods. Things are getting more and more competitive because you can buy things directly from the people who make them. Before, shops used to have a bit of a say on how much the cost of goods were. That's now changing as consumers were getting smarter, and we're understanding a little bit more where to get things cheaper, and online shopping is a big part of this. So that's the main covering of the topics for GDP and inflation. We're not done yet. We still got a few more topics to cover, so keep an eye on our next video.